Welcome to this week's episode of the Dynamis podcast. We're going to get really strategic and tactical with this week's episode. It's going to be focusing on the financing portion of purchasing real estate. And specifically, we've talked about how to leverage bank debt, the steps of the home buying process. But on this particular instance, we are going to deep dive. The whole purpose of this is to really do a really clear explanation of closing costs. What are your closing costs made up of? What changes them to be more expensive or less expensive? How do we manipulate the closing costs? Can we do anything about the closing costs? And so on and so forth. Now, along the way, I'm gonna pull back the curtain on mortgages in general, and I'm gonna talk about a couple other things as well. Number one, interest rates. We're gonna discuss quickly interest rates. We're gonna talk about things like pricing and pricing adjustments. So, how you can get a better interest rate by kind of massaging the file one way or the other. We're going to talk about conforming loan limits, and we're going to talk about, how interest rates are priced, where you can see them like legitimate interest rates without any of the hype from, one lender or the other. And we're also going to talk a little bit about, comparing programs and figuring out what is actually a beneficial and good deal. What I mean is sometimes when we're looking at interest rates and we're comparing a conventional interest rate to an FHA interest rate, when we look at the difference in those interest rates, one, for example, like a conventional, let's go with a conventional rate, could be like 7%, and an FHA could be at 6%. But when you do the comparison side by side, you're actually going to save money sometimes with the conventional, even with a higher interest rate, because of certain things like mortgage insurance for the life loan, so on and so forth. So we're going to go top to bottom through that. But the main purpose of this episode is to really give you a thorough, deep dive understanding of what closing costs are, what they're made up of, and how we determine them. So what I'm going to do here is, if you are listening strictly on the podcast, if you're only listening on audio, I would encourage you, go to YouTube, check this episode out if you're a visual learner, because what I'm going to do today is I'm going to record my screen and I'm going to take you through a couple scenarios. So I'm going to talk it out loud, so you're still going to get the full benefit of listening in the audio. But if you're a person that wants to see numbers, I'm going to go through it on the screen share, and I'll post that on YouTube. So let's start at the very top of interest rate shopping. Okay. I hear people all the time shopping lenders for interest rates. And here is just the legitimate truth of mortgages and interest rates in general. When I have a client who is wondering what the market is doing, I always encourage them to go to this website called mortgagenewsdaily.com. The reason that I like them to do that is because what it does is it pulls up data from the mortgage-backed securities market, and it shows them kind of like a stock ticker of what the market's doing that day. And it gives them interest rate pricing without kind of what banks put on as overlays of like interest rate discounts or whatever. The reason that I like this is because it shows you what the straight up market is doing. So if you get a letter in the mail, for example, that says, hey, we can offer you a 5.625% interest rate, you kind of got to ask yourself, well, is this true? Is this really an acceptable interest rate? And if you go to this website called mortgagenewsdaily.com, you can see what the market is trading at. It's publicly available information. Mortgages are packaged up together, and they are bought and sold between banks on a market, like Wall Street. Okay. And it's called the mortgage backed security market. And there are values associated with them. And it shows you what the interest rates are for a 30-year fix, for an FHA, for a VA, for, a 15-year, a jumbo. And so it doesn't put any of the fluff on it. When you get those letters in the mail, it's really a marketing ploy. People are trying to hook you to call to start the application. And then they're going to talk to you and they're going to say, hey, the interest rate that we advertised, well, we do have that, but that's for a different borrower. That's for a borrower with an 801 credit score. So sorry, you only have an 800 credit score. Oh, and by the way, we can still give you that interest rate, but it's going to cost, this much in points. Would you like to pay for, a cheaper interest rate, and blah, blah, blah. It's just a marketing tactic. And so if you're listening to this, you want to know what interest rates are, I encourage you, Mortgage News Daily. It's the best resource. Mortgage News Daily is going to quote you an interest rate with a 750 or above credit score with at least 20% down, but still it gives you what the market is actually doing without any of the fluff. Now, this leads me into a segue into my second point of like, should you buy points? Well, You should be working with a lender that very clearly advises you, is a mortgage advisor, and helps you make more money on this purchase. And they're going to make a determination with you about the cost benefit analysis of should you buy points and when should you buy points. There's two ways to lower your interest rate purchasing points. The first way is called a permanent interest rate buy down. It's literally you pay cash to buy a cheaper interest rate. So when you pull up pricing sheets, banks attach, banks have all their rates. All right. So to take a kind of a small deviation here, there are different types of lenders. There's lenders that work directly for the bank and they only have access to that bank's interest rates. Then there are brokers. Brokers, they're kind of funny. Brokers have the ability to see multiple banks' interest rates, but what's sneaky about brokers is they can sneak fees in the background to earn what's called a back end yield spread. So when they sell this loan to the bank, they can make more money on it. And it's not always clear when they disclose the loan how they're making money on it. They can, instead of waiving, for example, they could like waive their origination charges, but sneak it in some weird fee somewhere in the back end on the loan disclosure. And so you kind of have to really thoroughly understand what you're getting from them. Then there's lenders called, that work in retail. All right. Retail lenders. And by the way, brokers, they don't close you. So they just match you up with a bank. They make sure you fit the guidelines and they hand you off. Retail lenders have access to every single bank. They have access to any bank you could think of, any, what we call investor who's going to hold a mortgage for you. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac products. You have, Wells Fargo, Chase, US Bank, whatever it is, Planet Home Lending, whoever the investors are that are purchasing mortgages, retail lenders get to look at all of them. You click on that bank and it opens up what's called a rate sheet. And that rate sheet shows you, hey, here's the par interest rate for today. Here's the free interest rate. If you want a slightly cheaper interest rate, here's how much it costs, and so on and so forth, all the way down to very, very cheap interest rates, but the cost is going to get very, very expensive. And so we're not going to stick here too long. We're not going to spend too much time on here on determining how do you know if it's appropriate to purchase interest rate points. But on a permanent buy down, essentially what you do is you do the cost benefit analysis. It's a really easy way to do this. You figure out how much is the interest rate cost to buy the cheaper interest rate, how much is that monthly savings, and then you just divide the savings by the cost and you figure out, well, at what point am I going to break even from this purchase of the cheaper interest rate? Then you have to kind of make a determination based on your knowledge of the market. And that determination is, do I think that the market is going to continue to degrade and get worse interest rate pricing after I break even from purchasing this interest rate? Or do I think the market's going to improve before I break even? Because if the market improves before you break even, it's really not worth purchasing the points to buy a cheaper interest rate when you can just capture a lower interest rate through a refinance. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So you got to be working with somebody who's a rock star who really, really understands how to advise you on making these decisions in the marketplace. Now, we talked about a permanent interest rate buy down. When you want to execute a permanent interest rate buy down is when you think you're kind of at the valley of the market, meaning you don't foresee that interest rate pricing is going to improve for, a foreseeable amount of time. We're at the market low. All right, let's go ahead and execute a permanent rate buy down. It's going to give us, lower payment, pay less interest over time. If, however, we're at the top of the interest rate market cycle and we think interest rates are going to go down, we're probably not going to want to do a permanent rate buy down. We're going to want to execute what's called a temporary buy down. These are much cheaper options and they lower your interest rate a lot. So you could do a 2-1 buy down, for example, that lowers your interest rate 2% the first year you close, 1% the next year, and it jumps back up to the regular interest rate that you locked at year 3. The benefit is if you think the market is going down, okay, you're just going to refi out of that product and capture the lowest interest rate. So it's a way to kind of subsidize your payment for the first couple of years until you time the lower interest rate. Now, this is somewhat speculative because we never know what the market's going to do, but based off of trends and, what we understand about the market, we can make a determination, hey, it's probably more advisable to do a temporary buy down here than a permanent buy down. So we're going to move on from there. I don't want to spend too much time here, but that's essentially how it works. Okay. So the next thing that I want to talk about, and then we're going to get into the meat and potatoes, which is, really focused on closing costs. The next thing that we're going to talk about is here's actually a good interjection is how do lenders get paid? A lot of people have this question. How do people who originate the mortgages get paid? This is an excellent question. It's something that's really important and powerful for you to understand because the lender that you're working with has every incentive to find you the lowest interest rate. The good news is about what you as the client or the borrower experience with the lender is you're not directly paying the lender their compensation. This is great news. How guys like me get paid is when we find a bank that gives us favorable terms and interest rates for our borrowers, we choose to lock an interest rate with that bank. Once we lock an interest rate with that bank, I take you all the way through closing. I hold your hand. I gather the documents. I'm making sure I'm staying in contact with the agent and title and keeping you on track on your schedule. Once we're closed, we transfer the servicing, meaning the monthly payments of that mortgage, to the bank or the investor that we locked the interest rate with. Once that happens, the bank is grateful, essentially, that we are placing this mortgage inside of their portfolio because now they get to earn 30 years of interest, which is how they're making all their money. And for their gratitude, they compensate the loan originator a portion or a percentage of the loan amount. Typically, loan originators make anywhere from 0.85% of the loan amount up to 1.5 is pretty average. I have on occasion seen loan originators earn 2% on the loan from the bank. But the important thing to know about this is the compensation of the loan originator is fixed, meaning they cannot change the compensation amount they get from person to person or bank to bank. And so what that means for you as a consumer is that they have every incentive to find the lowest interest rate, hand that off to the bank, and the bank is compensating them. It's not coming directly out of your pocket. So it's a win for you because you have an originator who's really highly motivated to find you the best interest rate and terms. All right. So moving on to comparing loan programs, because I have a lot of people right now, especially in weird market cycles where interest rates are higher. We're looking at interest rates. And when you're comparing an FHA to a conventional, for example, conventional interest rates could be a full point higher than FHA. But when you really do a deep dive and compare the two, here, in fact, this is where I'm going to switch over to a screen share here because we're going to start getting a little more tactical. I want to show you some very particular things here. So I prepared a loan comparison between 3 separate scenarios, and we're going to do that right now. So I'm going to share my screen. And in these scenarios, we have 3 separate scenarios. Okay. We have a conventional 5% down closing on May 2nd. We have an FHA with 5% down. Now, FHA typically has 3.5% down. I have a whole other podcast episode comparing the different loan programs from USDA, VA, conventional. But all you need to know here is that FHA is typically 3.5% down. The reason that I left it at 5% down is because I wanted to give you a really clear breakdown of what closing costs actually consist of. And so I thought it was more beneficial to leave the down payment exactly the same. So we have a conventional 5% down. We have an FHA 5% down. Both of those are closing on May 2nd. And in scenario number 3, we have a conventional 5% down, but that's closing May 30th. And I'm going to save that scenario to the very end so I can show you how closing costs differ depending on what time of the month we close. But here we have a conventional 5% loan down, conventional 5% down loan with an interest rate of 6.75%. And we have an FHA with 5% down, okay, with an interest rate of 5.75%. So it's a full 1 interest rate point difference, 1% difference between 6.75 and 5.75. What gets really interesting here is when we look at the monthly payment between these 2 programs, if you look, the monthly payment is actually pretty darn comparable. The conventional is $4,790 a month, and the FHA is $4,584 a month. Now, there have been some instances where I've actually seen the conventional scenario have a lower total monthly payment. And the reason that is because when you have a loan that is less than 20% down, you have to pay this thing on a conventional loan called mortgage insurance. So in this scenario, the mortgage insurance ends up being about $123 a month. So the principal and interest on 6.75% is the principal and interest is $4,005. Add in your mortgage insurance of $123. Throw in some taxes and insurance. We'll just, call $541 for taxes and $120 for insurance, and you're left with a total monthly payment of $47.90. Now, when we compare the FHA, the principal and interest payment is a lot lower, 5.75% principal and interest is $3,666. But if you look at the mortgage insurance on an FHA, it's double. It's double what the conventional is at $255 a month. Same taxes, same insurance, total monthly payment is within $200 of each other. Now, just to make this a little more interesting, I want to talk really quickly about conforming loan limits and 20% down scenarios. Depending on where you live, you can Google this. Just Google whatever county you live in, conforming loan limit. And what happens is it will tell you exactly the conforming loan limit amount and for your county. And why that's important is when we're doing loan scenarios, we figure out what's the conforming loan limit in your county, and we want to try and fit your loan limit within that conforming loan limit box. Because as soon as we have a loan amount higher than the conforming loan limit, what happens is you start getting negatively impacting on those pricing sheets I told you about from banks. The banks go, hey, this is higher than the conforming loan limit, and we're going to punish this person by putting a pricing overlay on there and giving them a pricing hit. So you start getting worse interest rates. Here's a perfect scenario. Conforming loan limit up here where I live is $806,000. I was doing a loan scenario and we had a loan amount of $1,000. When I was pricing interest rates were 7.875%. Okay. I was looking at the scenario thinking like, how can my interest rates be this terrible? And I realized, oh, dang it, I'm just over the conforming loan limit. And this person, by the way, was putting down $250,000 already. So I reran the scenario, just putting an extra $1,000 down to get within the conforming loan limit. And their interest rate dropped from 7.875, I believe, down to flat 7% even. 7% could have got 6.99 if we paid, $300 for the points. My point is like, you really want to have a keen set of eyes of where the file is, because they could have paid substantially more in interest just because I wasn't aware of the conforming loan limit. So you really want to make sure you're working with somebody who sees the whole puzzle. Now, if you did a comparison on interest rates between the 7% and let's call it a 6% at the same price point, same amount down, in that scenario, their monthly payment going conventional would have actually been cheaper because there's no mortgage insurance once you put 20% down. The conventional loan, the mortgage insurance falls off once you have 20% equity. Okay. The FHA, it's stuck with it for the life of the loan. Now, sometimes it makes sense to go FHA, especially in higher interest rate environments, because when you refinance, you can capture a lower interest rate. But I don't want to spend too much time here either. I just kind of wanted to explain, loan programs and conforming loan limits. So now we're going to get to the main event here. We're going to get into closing costs and what are closing costs made up of and how are they manipulated? Okay. So there's really a few things that impact closing costs. All right. Closing costs are the total of what I call 4 separate levers. Lever 1 are you have miscellaneous things like loan origination charges, appraisal fees. Did you purchase points for a cheaper interest rate? So on and so forth. That's lever number 1. Lever number 2 is the title company. When you execute a transaction, you use a title company. The title company charges fees. The other 2 levers are pretty standard, but they vary depending on when in the month we close. So the other 2 levers are taxes. So depending on where you live, the taxable amount, and insurance. Now, insurance varies drastically. For example, California and Florida, insurance is astronomically expensive, but you live in a market like, I don't know, we'll say Nevada or, somewhere in the Midwest, not really affected by natural disaster, insurance is very reasonable. Closing costs, when people are looking at their closing costs, they're like, well, geez, Louise, what are all these things? What are all these charges? That's it. It's the title company, it's your taxes, your insurance, and it is the miscellaneous charges, title fees, appraisal, so on and so forth. So what I want to do is I want to really break down what closing costs are made up of. We're going to go into it, how closing costs are determined, and what makes closing costs more expensive or less expensive. We're going to compare the conventional 5% down with the FHA 5% down, closing the same day of the month. And then we're going to contrast that with a conventional 5% down, but closing on the end of the month. Day of the month that you close matters a lot. It really, really impacts how expensive your closing costs are. Okay. So what are closing costs? Well, if you look here between these 3 scenarios, conventional 5% down closing costs on May 2nd, $11,631. But that same closing day for FHA, the closing costs are $21,707. Same loan, conventional, same down payment, but now closing on May 30th, we're only at $8,434. So why is that? Well, let's get into it. So the first line in your closing costs, the loan fees, okay? These are things like, lender credits, upfront mortgage insurance. Now, if you're not buying your interest rate, you shouldn't have any lender fees in here. It should be zeros across the board for lender fees. If you're doing let's say like an FHA loan, you're going to have the mortgage insurance in the closing cost. It's bunched in with the closing cost right up front. On this scenario, $10,806 of the closing costs are upfront MIP. So moving down into section number 2 here. So section number 2 are taxes and insurance. So in taxes and insurance, they're broken down into 2 separate categories. We have what's called prepaid interest and we have hazard insurance. All right. And what these are made up of, these prepaid interest charges are, the best way to explain it is we collect interest up front from the day that we close to the end of the month, which is why your closing costs and your prepaid interest are much more expensive at the beginning of the month versus the end of the month. So for example, the first 2 scenarios, closing on May 2nd, okay, the prepaid interest for the conventional, May 2nd, we're going to collect $3,311 for prepaid interest. When we move to the FHA, remember we have a lower interest rate. Prepaid interest for the month of May is $2,821. Now, to contrast that, if we changed our closing date to the end of the month, let's say May 30th, we're only paying $114. I want you to think about this difference in closing costs. Closing on May 30th versus May 2nd saves you almost $3,200 in closing costs right there, just because of the day of the month that you close. Now, the other thing that we collect in prepaid items are, we collect prepaid hazard insurance. Typically we collect 12 months of insurance up front, just to make sure that your policy is completely covered after funding. The next category of closing costs are what's known as impounds. When you pay your mortgage, a portion of your mortgage goes to principal and interest. The other portion goes towards things like taxes and insurance. Depending on the state and county you live in, taxes are paid irregularly. It's not just paid, once a month, and it's paid out of your escrow account for you when you pay your mortgage. So you make your mortgage payment, your taxes and insurance are automatically paid for you. How this works is every time you make a payment, a portion of it goes into this escrow account. It builds up every single time you make your payment. And then when the tax bill is due, it just automatically takes it out of that account for you. The reason that the impound account is collected up front is because if you were to close on your home and the very next day taxes were due, the bank wants to make sure that your taxes are going to get paid and the county's not going to put a lien on your house and you go immediately into foreclosure right after purchasing your home. So we collect it up front to make sure taxes and insurance can get paid. It's paid out of an impound account, and that's what that charge is. So far we have the impound account that collects your taxes and insurance for your first tax bill. Now, how that works, by the way, if you were to refinance or sell, if there's excess money in there, that money comes right back to you. That's your money. It's just a savings account to pay your taxes. Okay. So we have the impound account, we have the prepaid interest and insurance. And keep in mind, the interest is more expensive at the beginning of the month because we're getting billed each day for that versus the end of the month. Maybe there's only one day of interest. And then we have our insurance premium upfront for year 1. And then that leaves us with our final category of closing costs here. And these are what's known as third-party fees. So the third-party fees include title company, the government and recording fees, and of course, the appraisal. And the appraisal is probably the most interesting. Title fees, they just are what they are. You can definitely shop title companies and find your best value. Same thing with insurance providers. I encourage everyone to shop insurance. Appraisals are interesting. We have no access to the appraisal company. We have to order through a third-party website. They bid on the job, take the job. It's a pretty much fixed fee, but they demand full payment before they even step foot into your property to conduct an appraisal. It's an interesting gig. It's the only job I know of that demands full upfront payment before they deliver anything. So, you know, that being said, it's just part of the process. It is what it is. But that's what makes up the closing costs. And that's why, depending on what day of the month or loan program you choose, your closing costs vary. The closing costs really have almost nothing to do with the lender whatsoever, except for the fact if you choose to purchase interest rate points. It's just taxes, prepaid taxes, insurance, and these third party fees. So what I'm going to do here is what I thought would be very helpful, because these closing costs are really ambiguous. Everybody's always like, what are your closing costs? What are your closing costs? And I celebrate the question. I think it's a great question for people to ask. But I also feel like, when you're asking that question, you don't fully understand what closing costs are made up of. There really shouldn't be that much of a difference in closing costs from lender to lender. If there's a lender that has astronomically expensive closing costs for some reason, it's because, well, quite frankly, they're putting something in there somewhere to earn a little extra. There shouldn't be anything extra on the lender side. So when I started my investing journey, when I started purchasing, I had no idea how to read a loan disclosure, what any of this stuff meant. It was really ambiguous. And so what I thought would be helpful is to have my wife in here. And essentially, I was like giving this presentation to her through the podcast form. And what I thought would be interesting to do and helpful to the audience is to open it up to her and ask her, hey, when you first started on your journey, were there any questions about closing costs that you had specifically that you didn't understand from this presentation that I could deep dive into further? Because if she didn't understand something when she first started, the likelihood of somebody else having the similar question is very, very high. So I thought it'd be helpful. So we're going to organically turn it over to her and just give her the floor of any follow-up questions about anything that was unclear during this presentation.
Okay, so when it comes to the prepaid interests, I understand that date of the month that it closes matters. So is that prepaid interest number just for that month? What's the time frame?
Yeah, it's from the date of closing. The prepaid interest is collected from the date of closing through the end of the month, because each subsequent mortgage statement is going to include, when you have a monthly principal, interest, tax, and insurance payment, it's fixed. Adjusts sometimes if, let's say, the the tax assessment on your property adjusts, your mortgage payment kind of increases periodically. But typically, on an annual basis, your mortgage payment is fixed. Okay, so the principal and interest is always fixed. The only thing that's adjustable on an annual basis is the taxes and your insurance variability. So every subsequent payment after closing is going to be exactly the same for one calendar year. So the prepaid interest is collected from the day we close to the end of the month. So for example, let's say we closed on May 28th. Okay, there's 31 days in May. 28 is our first day we close. We're going to collect interest on May 29, 30, and 31. Let's say that our interest rate was 7%. So there's a calculation. So let's say a loan amount was 500,000, interest rate of 7%. We're collecting 7% on 500,000 amortized over a 30-year term for 3 days, Monday, 29, 30, and 31. We total that up, and that is the prepaid interest that'll be collected as part of the closing cost. Your next payment is going to go directly through the servicing company, and it's going to be fixed for the duration of the year.
Okay. So my second question for you, and this is going back a little bit, for the depending on where you live and what area you're in about that limit. The number you used was 807K versus the 806K.
Yeah, so conforming loan limits vary state by state and county by county. If you're wondering what your conforming loan limit is, it's super easy. You just Google search, whatever county conforming loan limit. So San Diego County conforming loan limit, Pierce County conforming loan limit. And these conforming loan limits are updated annually, and it'll pop right up. It'll tell you exactly what your county conforming loan limit is. Now, typically there's a national average conforming loan limit, but there's exceptions in what's called high cost areas. Why that is, for example, if we were trying to get a conforming loan that was a national average and we're comparing a house from the middle of nowhere, Nebraska to San Diego or Seattle, there's no way that anybody's going to be able to qualify with a conforming loan limit in San Diego or Seattle. And so in high cost areas, the government increases the conforming loan limit to incentivize primary homeownership. Keep in mind, the government wants Americans to own homes. And so they don't want to punish people who are just starting out, who happen to live in a high cost market by not adjusting that conforming loan limit accordingly, county by county. That's also, though, why you can see two neighboring counties have different conforming loan limits. So you could have a house on one side of the street have a lower conforming loan limit than a house on the other side of the street if the county line ran straight down the middle of the street. Even though the neighborhood is the same cost point, you could have a difference in qualifying, punitiveness depending on which side of the street they live on and where the conforming loan limit falls.
So for that appraisal fee that you had mentioned, I understand that they get paid up front. Is that something that I, as the borrower, am paying right away, or is it something that is going to come later, someone covering it in the meantime?
Yeah, so this is done two ways. It depends on the loan product, but typically so on most government products is typically something that's paid up front, but regardless, it's still included in your closing costs. So when you get a loan estimate or a loan disclosure, it's going to still add the cost of the appraisal as the total, but it'll reduce it out of your cash necessary to close if you pay it up front. I'll just give you a really good example. VA loans typically, so for most conventional loans, the appraisal company sends a payment request to the borrower. And they're like, hey, please pay us and we'll show up and we'll schedule you. With VA loans in particular, the appraisal company doesn't send a payment request to the borrower, and it can be covered out of proceeds from closing. But if it was paid up front, it would just reduce the overall cash to close. The reason it's still included in your closing cost is because they want you to have a full, think of the closing disclosure as like a receipt of the loan. So it totals all charges. Even if you've already paid it, it makes an annotation that, hey, this has already been paid. We're reducing this from the necessary cash to close.
Really, I think those were the three that came to mind. I thought everything else was explained really well. I mean, it was all explained really well. Those were just the three I wanted to dive in a little bit deeper.
Yeah, and these are like very, very common questions, and it's super ambiguous. So if you ever have any questions, like let's say you have a particular scenario that you want to know exactly what the closing cost would be for this day of the month in this county, this is very ambiguous, but I have a really, really, really easy and visually lovely way of demonstrating this and breaking this down. So if you're listening to this podcast and you're confused on what your scenario would look like, your payment, which program is better, how closing costs are determined, what time of the month would make your closing costs more expensive or less expensive, reach out to me and I will happily sit with you. We can either do it on a Zoom call or I can make you your own personal, scenario breakdown and send it over to you and you can keep it and look at it as many times as you want. But this is something that I really have a passion for doing. It's educating and empowering borrowers to understanding what these costs are. So feel free, use me as a resource, reach out any single time. You can find me on Instagram at Gurul Tim. My email address is tgurul, Gurule at allwestern.com. I'm happy to dive into all of this. The reason that I recorded this podcast is I find myself constantly having this conversation and the light bulb went off of like, man, if this is a regular conversation, there's probably a lot of people who have the same exact question. And it'd be really beneficial to just put this out to the universe. And hopefully you guys walk away more empowered and more ready to take on your next deal. So thank you for listening. I hope it was helpful. If you have any follow-up questions or feedback, please reach out. There's always polls underneath the podcast, wherever you listen, and we'll catch you on the next one. We'll see you on the next one on your march to multi-millions and beyond. Catch you on the flip side.